The First World War was the deadliest human conflict during its time. It claimed the lives of more than 15 million troops and civilians. The trench soldiers lived amongst rats, disease, illness, and rotten corpses. During a time of artillery, poison, and bombs, one of the deadliest killers during the war was the trench, the place where troops would call home for weeks at a time. In this video, we will discuss the life of a trench soldier during World War I. But before we do, ensure you subscribe to be on the date for more videos like this. Trenches were primarily on the Western Front and were built as a form of protection from modern artillery and machine guns. They were built in curved lines so that enemies would not have a straight firing line if they ever managed to infiltrate the muddy hell. At the beginning of the war, trenches were merely ditches. But, as the war prolonged, they became more complex. There were support trenches that housed the sick and the kitchen, while communication trenches acted as passages for movement. While the design of the trenches became more complex, the quality of life within them only deteriorated. When you think of a home, you think of warm, cozy carpets and rugs by the fireside. This was only a dream for the soldiers of the Great War who would call a trench their home. Rainwater would fill the trenches, leaving them waterlogged and creating the perfect environment for trench foot, a painful infection of the feet caused by long immersion in water or mud. Many of the soldiers died of trench foot before ever being shot by a bullet. As the trenches were dug on cultivated lands, prolonged exposure to the damp mud sometimes led to gas gangrene, amputation, and even death. To prevent the horrible condition, troops were ordered to rub their feet with whale oil and stomp around in unison to encourage blood flow. But even with the many precautions, approximately 75,000 British soldiers died of trench foot. If you think losing legs and toes were bad, poison gas attacks were even worse. The Germans introduced the chemical weapon at Ypres, Belgium, in April 1915. A British officer described the scene as a panic-stricken rabble of Turcos and Zouaves, with gray faces and protruding eyeballs, clutching their throats and choking as they ran, many of them dropping in their tracks and lying on the sodden earth with limbs convulsed and features distorted in death. This first attack killed an estimated 1,000 unprepared soldiers. The gases used during the war were chlorine gas and mustard gas, with phosgene gas being the deadliest of them all. Phosgene gas was responsible for 85% of the poison gas fatalities of World War I. Chemical warfare was banned in 1899 at the Hague Convention, but that still could not save the 91,000 troops who died from poison gas attacks. For troops to continue the fight, food was essential. The British Army hired 300,000 cooks to supply the food. Required to intake 4,000 calories a day, the troops' diet consisted of boiled plum puddings, vegetables, bully beef, bread, and jam. It was basic, yet filling. Most times bread would be stale, but that did not stop the troops from using them to boil soup in their sandbags. The sandy, stale soup saved many lives. By the winter of 1916, there was a shortage of flour. As a result, grounded turnips were being used to produce diarrhea-inducing bread. By then, the troops also had to eat pea soup with horse meat as their main course meal. Weeds and nettles were also used in soups as vegetables. A mysterious condition rippled throughout the First World War. Many troops were wounded, but with no obvious physical injuries. As British doctors were already struggling to treat trench foot, trench mouth, and gas gangrene, shell shock added to the troubles of the troops and medics. Clifford Lane of the Hertfordshire Regiment described his experience. "Every time I went over the top, I should say almost every time, somebody went insane. Only one person probably, but I can see them now coming along, singing. They've absolutely lost their control of everything." I can remember one man coming along with two men, one either side holding his arms, singing, "Under the Old Apple Tree." He was blaring it out, top of his voice. And almost every time I've seen men taken out of the line, but there weren't many. But people being dazed, lying on a fire step. After a bombardment, dazed, that was quite common. Headaches, blindness, deafness, tremors, depression, and anxiety were symptoms of the terrible condition. Doctors first believed it was a result from exposure to creeping barrage and constant bombardment, but when troops who were never exposed to the blasts began to show these same symptoms, shell shock was deemed as a sign of cowardice and weakness. It was seen as a lack of manhood rather than the result of witnessing and partaking in extreme violence. Believing that the troops needed to snap out of it, they were brutally treated through electric shocks to the neck, cigarettes on the tongue, and hot plates at the back of their throats. An estimated 325,000 British troops suffered from shell shock. Do you think you would survive living in the trenches during World War I? If you're curious to learn more, remember to subscribe.